Imagine a town that seems peaceful on the surface, but beneath that calm lies tension, a community struggling with hidden biases it barely knows exist. When Brandon Carter, a thoughtful 15-year-old, finds himself questioned by police just for waiting at a park, everything changes. His mother, Megan Carter, is Oakdale's mayor, and she's determined to make her community safe and welcoming for everyone. But as Megan pushes forward with a powerful anti-bias initiative, old divisions rise to the surface, sparking a journey that tests the town's values and Brandon's courage. As Oakdale faces moments of confrontation, unexpected alliances, and a march for unity that brings everyone to the edge, will Megan and Brandon's mission to transform their town succeed, or will it only deepen the divide? If you're moved by stories of resilience and unity, hit subscribe and turn on notifications for more real-life inspired stories that highlight the power of community. Let us know in the comments, what would you do to make a difference in your own town? And now, join us as we dive into Oakdale's journey for change. The sun was just beginning to dip lower in the sky over Oakdale, casting the small town's riverfront park in a warm, amber light that flickered through the branches of tall oaks and elms. Brandon Carter adjusted his backpack on his shoulder and made his way down the gravel path toward his favorite spot by the riverbank. It was late afternoon, the air cool and quiet, with the only sounds being the chirping of birds and the faint rustle of leaves. Brandon loved these moments, quiet, solitary pockets of time when he could think without interruption. Oakdale was a peaceful town on the surface, the type of place with a quaint main street, a cozy diner, and a neighborhood grocery store. But even at 15, he knew Oakdale had its share of problems, the kind that often went unspoken or ignored. He sat down on a large rock near the riverbank, letting his gaze drift over the slow-moving water. His mom, Megan Carter, would be here soon to pick him up. She'd had back-to-back meetings at City Hall today, something about the new community initiative she was leading, but she'd promised she wouldn't be late. He smiled, thinking of her, imagining her face as she passionately defended her ideas to the city council. Megan was the town's first black mayor, a woman who had risen quickly to lead her community with empathy and conviction. She'd always taught him to stand up for himself, to believe in the strength of his voice. But lately, Brandon had felt the weight of being one of the few black students in Oakdale's high school, and the truth was, it wore on him more than he let on. As he sat there, his thoughts wandering, a prickling sensation ran up the back of his neck, pulling him from his reverie. He opened his eyes, scanning the park. A middle-aged woman sat on a bench nearby, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Her eyes were narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. He quickly looked away, trying to ignore her, but the feeling of being watched was unsettling. He shifted slightly, his hands fidgeting, his pulse picking up as he waited for his mother. Ellen Peterson couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at her. She'd come to Riverfront Park to enjoy a quiet afternoon, but her eyes kept drifting back to the young man sitting by the river, a boy who seemed out of place. She frowned, wondering why he'd been sitting there alone for so long, and why he seemed to be glancing around. Ellen had always prided herself on her sense of awareness, the idea that she could spot trouble when it was near. Oakdale was a safe community, and she intended to keep it that way. She couldn't remember seeing this young man before, and she didn't like the thought of a stranger loitering nearby. After a few more moments of hesitation, she reached in her purse and pulled out her phone. Her hands trembled as she dialed, but she pushed down the slight unease in her stomach. She was doing the right thing, wasn't she? "Yes, hello," she said when the 911 operator answered. "There's a young man here at Riverfront Park. I'm not sure what he's doing, but he's been here for quite a while. He's alone, just hanging around, looks suspicious." The operator asked her a few questions, and Ellen's answers flowed out, her words quick and certain, as if she needed to convince herself as much as the dispatcher. She hung up with a sigh of relief, settling back on the bench, hoping she'd done the right thing. Brandon checked the time on his phone. 10 minutes had passed, and his mother hadn't arrived. He was considering calling her when he noticed a dark blue police cruiser pull into the parking lot. 2 officers stepped out, scanning the park, and Brandon felt a sudden tightness in his chest. He looked away, hoping they weren't there for him, but within moments, The officers had started walking in his direction. His hands grew clammy, and he rose slowly from his seat on the rock, his backpack hanging loosely over one shoulder. The officer stopped a few feet away, and the taller one spoke first. "What are you doing here, son?" His tone was firm but cautious, his gaze sweeping over Brandon as if assessing him for hidden dangers. Brandon swallowed, his heart pounding. "I'm just waiting for my mom. She's supposed to pick me up soon." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, who folded his arms. "Do you have any ID?" Brandon's pulse quickened. "I know, sir. I'm only 15. I don't have a driver's license." "Then I'd like to know why you're out here by yourself," the first officer said, his tone turning colder. "We got a call about suspicious activity." Brandon felt the urge to explain himself, to assure them he wasn't doing anything wrong, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He'd never been questioned like this before, never felt so exposed. He raised his hands slightly, feeling the weight of their scrutiny. "I'm not doing anything," he managed to say, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just sitting by the river." The officer's gaze didn't waver. "Let's keep those hands where we can see them, okay?" Brandon nodded, his mind racing, his palms damp with sweat. He wanted to tell them about his mother, to explain that she was the mayor, but something in their eyes made him hesitate. They wouldn't believe him, they'd just think he was making it up to avoid trouble. Just then, a familiar voice broke the tense silence. "He doesn't need an ID," the voice said, calm and steady, but with an edge that demanded attention. Brandon turned to see his mother, Megan Carter, standing a few feet away. Her gaze was locked onto the officers, her chin tilted upward in a way that spoke of both authority and resilience. The officers looked taken aback, and the taller one cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we were responding to a call." "I'm aware," Megan said, stepping closer, her eyes never leaving theirs. "But you're questioning my son, an honor student, an athlete, and a member of this community, as if he's a criminal. And I'd like to know why." The officers exchanged an uncomfortable glance, and the second officer shifted his weight, glancing away. "We didn't mean any disrespect, Mayor Carter. We were just following protocol." Megan folded her arms, her voice calm but unyielding. "Your protocol should involve understanding who you're dealing with before you make assumptions. My son has every right to be here, and he shouldn't have to prove that to anyone." Ellen Peterson, still watching from her bench, paled as the reality of the situation hit her. She called the police on the mayor's son. The conviction she'd felt only moments ago now crumbled beneath a weight of shame, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. Megan's hands were steady as she addressed the town council the following day. She stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of her colleagues, her friends, and a few strangers who had come just to see what she had to say. "This isn't about Brandon," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "This is about every young person in our town who deserves to feel safe and valued. Yesterday, my son was treated with suspicion simply because he was sitting in a public park, and that's unacceptable. We are better than this. We must be better than this." A ripple of murmurs passed through the room, and Megan could see both support and skepticism in the eyes of those around her. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready. She had seen the fear in her son's eyes, and she was determined to create a town where no one had to feel that way. Brandon watched from the back of the room, his heart swelling with pride as his mother continued her speech. For the first time in his life, he felt the power of her words reach him, filling him with both hope and a sense of purpose. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: they were just getting started. The following morning, Oakdale's community center was abuzz with talk of the previous day's incident. Mayor Megan Carter had decided to hold an open forum in the community hall, hoping to address concerns directly and engage residents in a productive conversation. But even as she arrived and greeted attendees, she could sense the room was divided. Some had come to show their support, but others wore expressions of disapproval or even suspicion. Megan took a deep breath, adjusting her blazer as she made her way to the front of the hall. She glanced out at the audience, her gaze briefly meeting Brandon's from the back row. He sat next to his best friend, Eli Mitchell, a quiet but perceptive sophomore who'd always supported Brandon. Eli's eyes showed a mix of sympathy and worry, and Brandon offered him a reassuring nod. Megan cleared her throat and began. Thank you all for being here. I wanted to take the time to speak directly to the community because this incident involves more than just my son, it involves all of us. I believe this moment is an opportunity for Oakdale to examine how we treat one another, how we protect each other, and how we ensure this town is welcoming to everyone, no matter who they are. From the middle of the room, Mark Daniels, a longtime business owner in Oakdale, raised his hand. He was known for his strong opinions, and Megan braced herself. Mayor Carter, I think you're blowing this way out of proportion, Mark said, his voice loud and clear. Oakdale is a safe town, and I don't see why we're suddenly questioning our values over one incident. People have every right to feel uncomfortable if they think something looks suspicious. That's just common sense. A murmur of agreement rippled through a small part of the crowd, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Brandon clenched his fists, feeling a pang of anger at Mark's words. Eli put a hand on his shoulder, giving him a subtle shake of the head, a reminder to keep calm. Megan held her composure. Mark, I appreciate your perspective, she replied. But this isn't about questioning the town's values. It's about expanding those values to ensure that everyone feels included and safe. We have to recognize when our assumptions are based on biases and be willing to address those biases. She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. I'm not here to accuse anyone. I'm here to ask that we work together to make Oakdale an even better place. One where parents don't have to worry that their child might be misunderstood simply because of how they look. As the forum ended, attendees filtered out in groups discussing Megan's message. Brandon waited until most of the crowd had dispersed before walking over to his mother. You did great, he said, giving her a small smile. I could tell some people were listening. Megan smiled back, though her eyes betrayed a trace of worry. Thanks, honey. I just hope it made a difference. She glanced around, her gaze landing on Ellen Peterson, who lingered near the door, her face flushed as she pretended to be engrossed in her phone. Megan considered approaching her, but decided against it, sensing that Ellen wasn't ready for a direct conversation. As they walked out, Megan's phone buzzed with a message from Officer Grant, one of the police officers involved in the incident. She'd known Grant for years, and he had always been a dedicated officer, but their exchange yesterday had felt different. Mayor Carter, I just wanted to say I understand your concerns. Let's meet next week to discuss how we can move forward. Megan felt a glimmer of hope. At least some of the town's officials were open to dialogue. She replied with a quick message agreeing to the meeting, then turned her attention back to Brandon. Looks like I'm meeting with Officer Grant next week, she said. Hopefully, he's willing to listen. Brandon nodded, but his gaze was distant. It just feels weird, he said finally. I always thought Oakdale was my home, but now I don't know. Some people looked at me differently today, like I was a stranger. Megan put a hand on his shoulder. Change doesn't happen overnight, she said softly. But you're helping to make that change by standing up and being visible. It's not easy, but I'm proud of you. Brandon managed a smile, though the uncertainty lingered in his eyes. As they walked to the car, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The real work, the work of changing minds and hearts, was yet to come. A few days later, Brandon found himself sitting in the cafeteria, picking at his lunch as his thoughts drifted to the events of the past week. Despite his mother's words, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. It was as if the world he'd known was slipping away, and he wasn't sure what would take its place. Hey, you okay? Eli slid into the seat across from him, his tray loaded with fries and a sandwich. Brandon forced a smile. Yeah, just thinking. Feels like things are different now, you know? Eli nodded. Yeah, I get it. But not everyone sees you that way. I mean, my mom was at the forum, and she totally supported what your mom said. A lot of people did. Brandon glanced around the cafeteria. Most of the students were busy with their own conversations, but a few shot him curious looks. It was subtle, but he could feel their eyes on him, as if he'd become something different, something they weren't sure they understood. Thanks, man, Brandon said, feeling a wave of gratitude for Eli's support. I don't know what I'd do without you. Eli shrugged, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Hey, that's what friends are for. Just as he was beginning to relax, he spotted Laura Thompson, a new student who had recently transferred from a nearby town. She was sitting alone at the far end of the cafeteria, her expression thoughtful as she watched the scene unfold around her. Laura had joined the school's debate club only a few weeks ago, and while Brandon didn't know her well, he'd sensed a quiet confidence in her. He got up and walked over, feeling an odd connection to her that he couldn't quite explain. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty seat across from her. She looked up, her expression softening. "Not at all." They talked for a few minutes, discussing school and their shared interest in history. Finally, Laura leaned forward, her gaze serious. "I heard about what happened in the park. I just wanted to say I'm sorry you had to go through that." Brandon looked away, feeling a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "Thanks. It's just surreal, you know?" Laura nodded, her voice quiet. "I get it. My family went through something similar when we lived in Chicago. People have all kinds of assumptions about who you are before they even know you." Her words struck a chord, and for the first time in days, Brandon felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he'd thought. The following week, Megan met with Officer Grant in her office at City Hall. Grant was a sturdy man in his early 40s, with a calm demeanor and a reputation for fairness. But today, he looked uneasy. "Thanks for meeting with me, Officer Grant," Megan said as she gestured for him to sit. "I appreciate your willingness to talk." Grant nodded, clearing his throat. "Mayor Carter, I respect you and your position. I just wanted to say I understand why you're concerned, and I think we might have some room for improvement in the department." Megan leaned forward, her eyes earnest. "Grant, this isn't about pointing fingers. It's about acknowledging that we all have biases and working together to address them. We need to make sure incidents like this don't happen again, not just for my son, but for every person in this community." Grant hesitated, then nodded. "We could start by offering more training on bias and community relations. Some of the guys on the force might push back, but I think it's a step in the right direction." Megan felt a surge of relief. "That's exactly what I was hoping for. If we can get the department involved in a training program, it'll send a message to the whole town." They discussed the details for another hour, laying the groundwork for what would become Oakdale's first anti-bias initiative. By the time Grant left, Megan felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to see it through. As she walked down the hall to her office, Megan passed a group of city council members, catching snippets of their conversation. Some were skeptical, but a few expressed quiet support. Megan squared her shoulders, knowing that every small step forward was a victory. Brandon felt the weight of the week pressing down on him. Ever since his mother's forum, people had been whispering, some subtly, some not so much. At school, a few students openly stared as he walked by, and he caught snatches of conversation that weren't exactly friendly. Though no one said anything to his face, he could feel the distance growing. Sitting in homeroom that morning, he tried to focus on his notebook, but the quiet wasn't comforting. Across the room, Jenny Marshall, one of his classmates, leaned over to her friend and whispered loudly enough for him to hear. "I don't get what the big deal is. He just looks suspicious. People are so sensitive these days." Brandon clenched his jaw, but kept his head down, willing himself to stay calm. He could feel his face warming, a mix of frustration and hurt bubbling up. Just then, the teacher, Mr. Alvarez, entered the room, breaking the tension. "All right, class," Mr. Alvarez said, setting his books on the desk. "Today we're starting our project on historical figures who inspired change. I want you to pick someone whose work challenged people's perspectives, opened doors, or made us rethink our assumptions." As Mr. Alvarez handed out the assignment sheets, he gave Brandon a slight nod. Brandon met his gaze, surprised by the understanding he saw there. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to calm the storm inside him. He took a deep breath, focusing on the assignment, feeling a flicker of determination. Maybe, just maybe, he could turn this into something meaningful. After class, Mr. Alvarez asked Brandon to stay behind. As the room cleared, Brandon packed his things slowly, curious but cautious. Once they were alone, Mr. Alvarez spoke. "Brandon, I wanted to check in with you. I know things have been tense lately, and I can see it's been hard." Brandon looked down, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah, it's been a lot." Mr. Alvarez nodded. "I understand. When I first came to Oakdale, I had to face some assumptions too. People didn't see a Latino teacher often in this town, And let's just say I was given a few warnings about how I should act. He chuckled, though his eyes held a trace of sadness. But over time, things changed. Not quickly, but little by little. Brandon looked up, surprised. How did you deal with it? I reminded myself why I was here, Mr. Alvarez said, his tone thoughtful. And I try to open up conversations with people, even if they didn't want to listen at first. Sometimes, people just need time to understand. Brandon felt a new sense of hope. Thanks, Mr. Alvarez. That helps. Mr. Alvarez clapped him on the shoulder. Anytime. And for your project, don't be afraid to make it personal. Your voice is part of this story, too. As Brandon left the classroom, he felt lighter, more determined. He realized that maybe his mother's work wasn't just her fight, it was his too. Meanwhile, Megan faced her own challenges. Mark Daniels had been vocal in his opposition to her anti-bias initiative, gathering support from a handful of local business owners who felt that her push for change was an attack on Oakdale's reputation. He'd even gone so far as to organize a town meeting of his own, arguing that outsiders were making Oakdale lose its values. Megan arrived at City Hall that evening for a council meeting and noticed a small group of protesters outside holding signs. Some read, "Preserve Oakdale's values," and "Say no to divisive policies." The sight was disheartening, but Megan kept her head held high as she made her way inside. In the council chambers, the tension was thick. Several council members were clearly uncomfortable, while others exchanged tense glances. Mark Daniels stood near the back, his arms crossed, his expression set in a defiant scowl. As the meeting began, Councilwoman Grace Thomas, one of Megan's supporters, spoke up. "I think Mayor Carter's initiative is necessary. It's a chance for our community to grow and to ensure we're inclusive for everyone." Mark raised his hand, interrupting her. "With all due respect, Grace, I don't think we need to change anything. Oakdale has always been a safe place. This is just stirring up problems that weren't there before." Megan took a breath, her voice calm but firm. "Mark, I respect your perspective, but we can't ignore what happened in Riverfront Park. Incidents like that aren't isolated. They happen because we have underlying biases that need to be addressed. If we don't, then we're not living up to the values we claim to hold." The room fell silent, tension hanging in the air. It was clear that Megan's words had struck a nerve, but she knew there was still a long way to go. A few weeks later, Brandon found himself in front of the entire school assembly. He hadn't expected Mr. Alvarez to suggest he speak, but the idea had grown on him. He could see a mix of curiosity and skepticism in the faces of his classmates, but he forced himself to stay focused. Taking a deep breath, he began, "I know some of you think what happened in the park was no big deal, that I'm making something out of nothing. But to me, that moment wasn't small. It was a reminder that some people still see me differently because of how I look." The room was silent, every eye on him. "I've lived in Oakdale my whole life. This is my home. But that day, I felt like a stranger. And that feeling isn't one anyone should have to experience. My mom's initiative isn't about shaming anyone. It's about creating a place where no one has to feel like they don't belong." He paused, glancing at Eli and Laura, who gave him encouraging nods. "This project isn't just for me. It's for everyone. It's about all of us doing better, being better." A few students started clapping, and soon, the applause spread through the auditorium. Brandon felt a wave of relief, a sense of hope he hadn't felt in weeks. Maybe his words had reached some of them. After Brandon's speech, there was a noticeable shift in the school. A group of students started a Unity Club, which met once a week to discuss ways to promote understanding and inclusivity. Laura, who had become one of Brandon's closest friends, suggested they organize a community event where people could share their own stories of feeling othered or misunderstood. Megan's anti-bias initiative began to gain traction as well. Officer Grant followed through on his promise, working with Megan to organize a series of workshops for the police department. Though some officers were resistant at first, Grant's steady presence and Megan's persistence gradually won them over. But not everyone was supportive. Mark Daniels continued to make his opposition known, and tensions simmered among some of Oakdale's older residents. Megan faced criticism at council meetings, and anonymous letters appeared in her office mailbox, questioning her intentions and even her place in Oakdale. One evening, Brandon found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of these letters in front of her. She looked up as he walked in, her expression weary. "Are those?" he asked, nodding to the letters. "Mekan Sighet." Some people aren't ready for change. But that doesn't mean we stop. Brandon sat down across from her. "It's worth it, Mom. I know it is." She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "Thank you, Brandon. Sometimes I just need a reminder." As the first community workshop approached, Megan decided to take a walk in Riverfront Park, the place where this journey had begun. The air was cool, and the trees cast long shadows over the path. She spotted the same bench where Ellen had sat that day, and she felt a surge of determination. Megan knew change would take time. She knew that some minds might never be swayed. But as she looked out over the park, she realized that every small step forward was progress. Each conversation a chance to plant a seed of understanding. As she turned to leave, she noticed a figure approaching Ellen Peterson. The two women exchanged a brief, tense nod before Ellen finally spoke. "Mayor Carter, I wanted to apologize," Ellen said, her voice quiet but genuine. "I realize now that I let my assumptions get the best of me, and I see what you're trying to do here. I don't agree with everything, but I respect it." Megan looked at her, surprised but grateful. "Thank you, Ellen. That means a lot." Ellen nodded, her gaze steady. "I'll be at the workshop tomorrow." The community center buzzed with quiet conversations as people filed in for the first anti-bias workshop. Megan stood near the entrance, greeting attendees, her pulse quickening as she watched more people arrive than she'd anticipated. Though some faces showed curiosity, others displayed reluctance. Megan was encouraged to see Officer Grant and several other members of the police department among the attendees. Even Councilwoman Grace Thomas had joined, along with a few of the high school teachers, including Mr. Alvarez. Toward the back of the room, Brandon sat with Eli and Laura, the three of them part of a small group of students attending to observe. Megan walked to the front, her voice calm as she began. "Thank you all for being here. This initiative is about more than just awareness. It's about how we can work together to ensure that every member of Oakdale feels safe, valued, and respected." She introduced Dr. Karen Holmes, an expert in community relations and bias training, who had traveled to Oakdale to lead the session. Dr. Holmes was in her 60s, with graying hair pulled back in a braid and an open, warm expression that put everyone at ease. "Thank you, Mayor Carter," Dr. Holmes said, giving Megan a nod. "Today, we'll be exploring the kinds of assumptions we all make, often without even realizing it. It takes courage to recognize these things in ourselves, and even more to work to change them." Dr. Holmes began with an exercise, asking each attendee to share something unique about their background or experience that others might not know. People hesitated at first, but as stories emerged, a quiet sense of solidarity grew. A police officer shared about his upbringing in a military family, constantly moving from one town to another. A high school teacher talked about being the first in her family to graduate college, and a local business owner recounted his challenges running a family business after immigrating to the U.S. as a child. As the stories continued, Megan glanced over at Ellen Peterson, who had kept mostly silent since her brief apology in the park. Ellen finally stood up, her face flushed. I grew up in Oakdale my whole life," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I thought I knew everyone here and what was best for this town, but I realized I don't. Not really. So, I'm here to listen and to try to understand." Brandon felt a surge of respect as he watched Ellen speak. Her words weren't perfect, but her sincerity was evident. He realized that even small steps, like Ellen's willingness to participate, mattered in ways he hadn't considered. Later that evening, Brandon and his friends gathered at Laura's house to debrief. Her parents were out for the evening, giving them free rein over the cozy living room. They settled on the couch with snacks, and for a while, they just relaxed talking about their day. But soon, the conversation turned serious. Laura glanced at Brandon. "I noticed how you looked at Ellen today. I think she's starting to understand, even if she's far from perfect." Brandon nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I never thought she'd change her mind about anything. But watching her today, it kind of made me think maybe there's hope for more people." Eli nodded. "We're starting to see that at school too. I know people who didn't care about this stuff a few weeks ago, but now they're talking about it. And he gave Brandon a nudge. You're kind of famous now. Brandon laughed, though his expression turned serious. It's weird, right? All of a sudden, people know my name, but I'm still just me. And I don't have all the answers. Laura leaned forward, her eyes thoughtful. That's what makes you real, Brandon. People listen to you because you're honest, and you're not pretending to be something you're not. Their words left Brandon thoughtful. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the chance to make Oakdale better. And for the first time, he felt the weight of that responsibility as something empowering rather than daunting. In the following weeks, Oakdale found itself divided. Megan's initiative sparked heated debates, and while the workshops continued to draw attendees, vocal critics still rallied against it. Mark Daniels had stepped up his efforts, organizing a group he called Protect Oakdale Values, dedicated to opposing Megan's initiatives and pushing back on what he claimed was an attack on the town's identity. One day, Mark posted a flyer on social media for a protest outside City Hall, calling it a stand for Oakdale. Megan scrolled through the comments with a heavy heart. Some were supportive, but others were filled with anger and resentment. Brandon sat beside her, reading over her shoulder. He's not backing down, is he? Megan Sighed. No, he's not. But he's not the only voice in this town. And every day, more people are coming forward to support us. Change takes time, and it takes patience. Brandon nodded, absorbing her words. He knew his mother was right, but it didn't make the resistance any easier to bear. The protest drew a substantial crowd, and tensions ran high as Mark Daniels took the microphone, speaking passionately about preserving Oakdale's values and protecting the community. Megan and Brandon stood near the back, watching, careful not to draw attention. Just as Mark's speech reached a fever pitch, a voice from the crowd spoke up. Isn't Oakdale's true value supposed to be about supporting each other? The speaker was Officer Grant, and his words cut through the tension, drawing murmurs from the crowd. Mark turned, momentarily taken aback. With all due respect, officer, this isn't about being unsupportive. It's about keeping things the way they've always been. Grant didn't back down. Sometimes keeping things the same isn't a strength, Mark. It's fear, and that fear stops us from moving forward. The crowd shifted uneasily, some clapping, others muttering in disagreement. But Brandon felt a swell of hope. For the first time, it seemed the two sides were at least listening to each other, if only for a moment. That evening, Megan and Brandon returned home, both drained but hopeful. Over dinner, they reflected on the day's events, each grappling with the weight of their responsibilities. I feel like I should be doing more, Brandon admitted, pushing his food around his plate. Megan looked at him, her expression both proud and understanding. Brandon, you're already doing more than most people would in your position. You're being brave, and you're using your voice. That's powerful. Brandon Mittergage. I want things to change faster. Megan reached across the table, squeezing his hand. Change takes time, and it's not always easy. But every voice, every story, adds up, and you're helping people see things differently. Brandon nodded, feeling the weight of her words. His mother had always been his greatest inspiration, and her resolve gave him strength. No matter how difficult things became, he knew he could count on her support. A week later, Brandon was at school when he was approached by Jenny Marshall, the same student who'd previously made dismissive comments about him in class. She looked nervous, clutching her backpack straps tightly. "Hey, Brandon," she said, her voice soft. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Brandon hesitated, unsure of what to expect. But he nodded, gesturing for her to join him in the hallway. She took a deep breath. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't understand before, but after seeing you speak and hearing what you had to say, I get it now. Or at least I think I do. I know it's not much, but I wanted you to know that I'm listening." Brandon was taken aback, but he saw the sincerity in her eyes. "Thank you, Jenny. That means a lot. And if you ever have questions, I'm here to talk." She smiled, a small but genuine gesture, before hurrying back to her class. Brandon watched her go, feeling a sense of progress. Small perhaps, but real. As winter settled in, Oakdale continued its journey toward transformation. The anti-bias initiative gained momentum, with community leaders stepping forward to join Megan in her mission. Town hall meetings became a regular occurrence, with both sides engaging in dialogue, sometimes tense, but always respectful. Brandon's Unity Club flourished, hosting events that encouraged students to share their stories and perspectives. They even organized a Diversity in Oakdale panel, inviting speakers from different backgrounds, including Officer Grant, Dr. Holmes, and Laura's parents, who spoke about their own experiences with discrimination. Each event brought new voices to the conversation, widening the circle of understanding. And though some people remained resistant, the tide was slowly turning. The crisp spring morning brought a sense of anticipation to Oakdale as residents gathered for the Unity March. It was the first event of its kind in town, a march organized by Megan's initiative and supported by Oakdale's Unity Club. Brandon, Laura, Eli, and a group of their classmates worked tirelessly in the days leading up to it, creating banners and spreading word around town. The march began at the community center and was set to end at Riverfront Park, a symbolic reminder of where everything had started. People held signs that read, "Unity in Oakdale" and "Together for Change," while others waved flags and balloons in a show of solidarity. Brandon and his friends led the way, with Megan and a few city council members marching beside them. Looking around, Brandon felt an overwhelming mix of pride and relief. This was his town, and for the first time in a long time, he felt fully accepted within it. But as they neared the park, the crowd encountered a smaller group of counter-protesters, led by Mark Daniels. His group held signs that read, "Preserve Oakdale's values and say no to division." The tension between the two groups was palpable, and the cheerful atmosphere grew strained as Mark took the microphone, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This so-called Unity March isn't about unity at all," he declared. "It's an attempt to change our town into something it isn't. We don't need outsiders telling us how to live or what to believe." Brandon felt a pang of frustration, but he kept his composure, glancing at his mother for reassurance. Megan, too, looked concerned, but she gave him a slight nod, encouraging him to remain calm. Just then, Officer Grant stepped forward from the crowd, his voice steady but firm. "With respect, Mark, I don't think this march is about division. It's about ensuring that Oakdale is a place where everyone can feel safe and welcome. Isn't that a value worth preserving?" Mark opened his mouth to respond, but the crowd's reaction drowned him out. Many began clapping and cheering, their support for Officer Grant unmistakable. Brandon felt a surge of pride. His town was changing slowly but surely. The march continued, ending peacefully at Riverfront Park. But as the crowd dispersed, Brandon noticed Ellen Peterson lingering near one of the benches, her face tight with anxiety. She caught his eye, hesitating before approaching him. "Brandon," she began, her voice uncertain, "I wanted to apologize again. I know I've said it before, but I don't think I fully understood. Watching today, seeing the support you have, it made me realize how wrong I was." Brandon looked at her, noting the vulnerability in her expression. He felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and surprisingly compassion. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. It means a lot to hear that." Ellen nodded, relief visible on her face. "I hope you'll forgive me one day." Brandon offered a small smile. "I think we're getting there." As Ellen walked away, Brandon felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Her apology wasn't a fix, but it was a step toward healing, and for now, that was enough. Later that evening, Brandon sat alone in his room, reflecting on the day's events. He thought about the months that had passed since that afternoon in Riverfront Park. The anger and fear he'd felt back then had evolved, replaced by a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. He opened his notebook and began to write, capturing his feelings on paper. He wrote about the Unity March, the support from his classmates, and even Ellen's apology. As he wrote, he realized how much he had grown, how much his perspective had shifted. In his final sentence, he wrote, "I am not defined by the assumptions others make about me. I am who I choose to be, and that will always be enough." Closing the notebook, he felt a new sense of peace. He knew there was still work to be done, but he also knew he was ready to be part of that work. A week after the Unity March, Megan held a press conference outside City Hall to announce the continuation of the Anti-Bias Initiative. Community members gathered to hear her speak, including Officer Grant, Mr. Alvarez, and Dr. Karen Holmes, who had become a close advisor in recent months. Megan's voice carried a calm authority as she addressed the crowd. The Unity March was a powerful reminder of what we can achieve when we come together. But this isn't the end. Today, I'm announcing the expansion of our anti-bias program to include workshops for all public employees and a new community dialogue series, where residents can share their perspectives and learn from one another. She paused, glancing over at Brandon, who watched her from the front row. Oakdale is changing. This initiative isn't about erasing the past, it's about building a better future, one where every person feels valued and respected. The crowd erupted in applause, and Brandon felt a swell of pride. His mother's dedication had sparked a movement, one that would continue to shape Oakdale for years to come. In the months that followed, Brandon and his friends took a more active role in leading the Unity Club at school. They organized regular meetings, hosted guest speakers, and facilitated discussions on topics ranging from cultural diversity to social responsibility. Laura, Eli, and others brought fresh ideas, expanding the club's reach to more students and even inspiring nearby schools to start similar clubs. Brandon, now a junior, often looked back on how much he had changed. He was no longer the quiet, unsure boy who sat alone by the river. He had found his voice, and more importantly, he had learned to use it. During the last meeting of the school year, Mr. Alvarez joined them, beaming with pride. "What you've accomplished here is incredible," he told them. "This club has become something bigger than any of us, and I know it will continue to grow." Brandon smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment. The Unity Club had become more than just a school project, it was his legacy. One evening, Megan and Brandon took a quiet walk through Riverfront Park, reflecting on the journey they had taken together. The air was warm, the sky painted with shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. They paused near the spot where Brandon had once been questioned by police, both of them lost in thought. "Mom," Brandon said finally, "thank you for everything. I don't know where I'd be without you." Megan looked at him, her eyes filled with pride and love. "Brandon, you've shown me what real courage looks like. I'm so proud of you for standing up, for being true to yourself, and for helping to change this town. Oakdale is a better place because of you." They stood in silence, each taking comfort in the other's presence. In that moment, Brandon knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same strength and resilience his mother had taught him. In the years that followed, Oakdale continued to change. Megan's anti-bias initiative became a staple in city policy, helping to shape a more inclusive and compassionate community. The Unity Club at Oakdale High grew into a respected organization, a space where students could openly discuss difficult topics and support one another. Brandon went on to graduate and attend college, majoring in social justice and public policy. His experiences in Oakdale had inspired him to pursue a career dedicated to making a difference, and he carried the lessons he'd learned with him into every chapter of his life. Back in Oakdale, Megan remained a beloved figure, her efforts celebrated by a town that had come to embrace her vision. Though there were still challenges, she continued her work with the same passion that had driven her from the beginning, her commitment to her community unwavering. Years later, Oakdale celebrated the dedication of a new mural in Riverfront Park. It was a vibrant painting depicting scenes from the Unity March, the town's various cultures, and symbols of peace and understanding. Brandon, now a young man, returned to Oakdale for the ceremony, standing beside his mother as they admired the mural. The artist, a former member of the Unity Club, spoke to the crowd. "This mural represents the journey Oakdale has taken, a journey from misunderstanding to empathy, from division to unity. This town has come a long way, and it's because of people who chose to stand up and make a difference." Brandon felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had played a part in this legacy. He looked over at his mother, who smiled at him, her eyes shining with pride. As the ceremony concluded, Brandon walked through the park, reflecting on the path that had brought him here. He knew that the work would never truly be finished, but he was grateful for the community that had grown alongside him, a community that had chosen to face its challenges with courage and compassion. And as he looked around, he felt a profound sense of hope. Oakdale's story was one of resilience and transformation, a story that would inspire generations to come. Years later, Oakdale celebrated the dedication of a new mural in Riverfront Park. It was a vibrant painting depicting scenes from the Unity March, the town's various cultures, and symbols of peace and understanding. Brandon, now a young man, returned to Oakdale for the ceremony, standing beside his mother as they admired the mural. The artist, a former member of the Unity Club, spoke to the crowd. This mural represents the journey Oakdale has taken, a journey from misunderstanding to empathy, from division to unity. This town has come a long way, and it's because of people who chose to stand up and make a difference. Brandon felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had played a part in this legacy. He looked over at his mother, who smiled at him, her eyes shining with pride. As the ceremony concluded, Brandon walked through the park, reflecting on the path that had brought him here. He knew that the work would never truly be finished, but he was grateful for the community that had grown alongside him, a community that had chosen to face its challenges with courage and compassion. And as he looked around, he felt a profound sense of hope. Oakdale's story was one of resilience and transformation, a story that would inspire generations to come. If you found Brandon and Oakdale's journey inspiring, please subscribe and join our community for more stories that highlight courage, empathy, and the power of unity. Together, let's continue the conversation about making our communities more inclusive and compassionate. Hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you won't miss any new stories. Share where you're watching from in the comments, and let us know how you're making a difference in your community.